In section 4.6, we will be learning about absolute value equations and inequalities. We will be learning to solve absolute value equations, and we will also be learning to solve absolute value inequalities. Before we go into solving equations and inequalities, we're going to talk about what is an absolute value as a review. Absolute value is how far a number is away from zero on a number line. So if I asked you what is absolute value of 3, this is asking how far is 3 away from 0, and 3 is 3 units away from 0, so absolute value of 3 is equal to 3. And also, if I ask you what is absolute value of negative 3, well, absolute value of negative 3 is also 3, so absolute value of negative 3 is 3 because it's 3 units away from 0. So today when we're talking about solving the absolute value equations, this time what we're going to be asking is, if I said the distance was 3, what are the two numbers that are 3 units away from 0? And you would say x equals 3 and negative 3. Okay, so here's an example. If I said absolute value of x is equal to x, what it's asking is what are the numbers that are 8 units away from 0? 8 units away from 0. And on a number line, those two numbers would be x equals 8 and x equals negative 8. So, the first example that I'm going to give you is to solve absolute value of x minus 3 is equal to 5. So your goal from now on is to try to get absolute value of x by itself, or absolute value by itself. So like any solving equations, we're going to do the opposite to get this alone. So this is minus 3, so we're going to add 3 to both sides. So absolute value of x is equal to 8, and now it's asking what numbers are 8 units away from 0, and those two numbers are, like above, it's 8 and x equals negative 8. So those are my two answers. Now let's make it a little bit more difficult. Now what we're going to do is we're going to solve. So I'm going to give you example number 2. And we are going to solve absolute value of 3x minus 6 equals 9. And I want to know what x value has to be so that when I get that number, it will give me the absolute value of the distance of 9. So I want the inside to be 9 or negative 9, so that absolute value of 9 is 9 and absolute value of negative 9 is 9. So now what we're going to do is we're going to split the inside into two parts. 3x minus 6, we're going to set that equal to 9, and we're going to make 3x minus 6 set that equal to negative 9. To figure out what x values would make the inside be 9 and negative 9. Because these two numbers are 9 units away from 0. So now once you set it up, we're going to add 6 to both sides. So 3x is equal to 15. And then when we divide by 3, x would equal 5. So when I plug in 5 in here, 5 times 3 is 15. And 15 minus 6 gives me 9. And absolute value of 9 is 9. Same thing again over here. We're going to add 6 to both sides. So then we have 3x is equal to negative 3 this time. And when we divide by 3, x is equal to negative 1. So now if I plug in negative 1, 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, and negative 3 minus 6 is negative 9, and then absolute value of negative 9 is 9. So those are my two answers. In example number 3, we're going to solve. And I'm going to make it even a little more complicated. This time I'm going to say 2 times the absolute value of x minus 5 plus 4 is equal to 2. I want to get absolute value of x minus 5 by itself. So note to self, do not distribute. And you always want to get absolute value by itself. So I want to get rid of this 4 first. So I'm going to subtract 4. And now I have 2 times the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to negative 2. And then to get rid of this 2, I got to divide by 2. Because this is 2 times, and I got to do the opposite. So then what I get is absolute value x minus 5 is equal to negative 1. Now remember, absolute value is asking how far a number is away from 0. So absolute value is distance. So remember, distance cannot be negative. So that means that absolute value can't be negative. So in this case, since absolute value of this is equal to negative 1, there is no x value that could make this ever be negative 1, so this will be no solution. These are solving absolute value equations. Now what we're going to do is we are going to solve compound inequalities. So absolute value